Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, I feel with this particular episode a sense of schadenfreude, of getting one back against someone who's done a great disservice to humanity.
Well, don't have too much schadenfreude with this. By the end of this episode, it's not exactly the riches to rags story that you would think it is.
Okay.
This is encompassing one of probably modern medicine's most controversial articles that's been written. It is the MMR anti-vaccine controversy. And look, this is undoubtedly, it's just one of the greatest frauds in modern medicine. The author, for those who don't know, is Andrew Wakefield, who has been described by the New York Times as one of the most reviled doctors of his generation.
Absolutely.
Time magazine listed him as one of history's greatest science frauds. Mm-hmm. And look, just as a bit of background, which we'll get into more later with our guest coming up, he was a British gastroenterologist turned researcher turned disgraced doctor and has now effectively become an icon of the anti-vaccine movement. His landmark quote-unquote study is a 6-page report in one of the most prestigious journals. It was the Lancet. And in February 1998, the title was given Ileal-lymphoid-nodular hyperplasia, non-specific colitis, and pervasive development disorder in children. Now, if you're not familiar with that, or it sounds like a bit of a mouthful, effectively, like most people actually don't know it by that title. And the media or the lay person's interpretation of this, which is now defunct, so I can't stress that enough. We're going to actually delve into this a little bit with quotations, but this is defunct. This has been retracted. Is that effectively MMR, the MMR vaccine, was associated or caused autism. Mm-hmm. And so this was heralded at the time by medical scholars and the media as a groundbreaking discovery. The article has dramatically altered vaccines since the time of the uptake of vaccines, and not just of MMR. In 2019, it's over 20 years since the article was written and later retracted, the World Health Organization listed vaccine hesitancy as one of the top threats to global health in 2019. And this is certainly one of those articles that has heavily contributed towards that.
Absolutely. It's why we see diseases once eradicated coming back into the world again.
That's right. And not only that, we saw a very big trend in COVID-19 of anti-vaccine, you don't know what's in it, don't trust the medical. And I would argue that you could probably trace a big component of that back to this article. Yeah. And again, we're just going to discuss some of the excerpts so that people are familiar with this study. And again, it has been retracted. The hypothesis has been rejected, and the claims either not reproducible or just straight out fraudulent.
Yes, I'm not actually overly happy that I get to voice Andrew Wakefield, by the way. That was not in my rider.
We have to bump up your contract a bit.
All right, so here's my first quote. I feel like I'm doing a melodramatic pantomime. Method: 12 children, mean age 6 years, range 3 to 10, 11 boys, were referred to a pediatric gastroenterology department unit with a history of normal development followed by loss of acquired skills, including language, together with diarrhea and abdominal pain. Findings: Onset of behavioural symptoms was associated by the parents with measles, mumps and rubella vaccination in 8 of the 12 children. All 12 children had intestinal abnormalities, ranging from lymphoid-nodular hyperplasia to aphthoid ulceration. Behavioural disorders included autism, 9, disintegrative psychosis, 1, and a possible post-viral or vaccinal encephalitis, 2. Patients and methods. 12 children consecutively referred to the Department of Pediatric Gastroenterology with a history of pervasive developmental disorder with loss of acquired skills and intestinal symptoms.
So these children were given assessments by neurological psychiatric methods. Colonoscopies were performed, biopsies taken both fresh and formalin. This was the terminal ileum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and the rectum. They had barium studies if they could tolerate it, and the imaging that was conducted was an MRI and an EEG.
Results. In 8 children, the onset of behavioural problems had been linked, either by the parents or by the child's physician, with measles, mumps and rubella vaccination. In these 8 children, the average interval from exposure to first behaviour symptoms was 6.3 days, range 1 to 14 days. One child, child 4, had received monovalent measles vaccine at 15 months, after which his development slowed, confirmed by professional assessors. Child 9 received measles, mumps and rubella vaccine at 16 months. At 18 months, he developed recurrent antibiotic-resistant otitis media and the first behavioural symptoms, including disinterest in his sibling and lactive play.
So what is going on here is the article's being presented in as such that Andrew Wakefield is saying that this intestinal inflammation, which by biopsies they're finding 9 out of 12 children had this lymphoid-nodular hyperplasia, effectively a reaction. And there was suggestion that it was an immunological reaction in the gastrointestinal tract. And this paper is pretty much just pointing the finger straight at the MMR vaccine.
Discussion. Despite consistent gastrointestinal findings, behavioural changes in these children were more heterogeneous. In some cases, the onset and course of behavioural regression was precipitous, with children losing all communication skills over a few weeks to months.
And so it's important to note that when this investigation started to come about, the researchers who were looking at this article suggested that by the time over 600,000 children had received the vaccine, there's going to be a potential link, but not causal, just an association of people who will have had the vaccine and had developmental issues. We're talking about 12 children in this paper. At that point in time, over 600,000 children had had a vaccine. But that being said, in the discussion, it does state there is not a proven association between MMR vaccine and the syndrome. Virology studies are underway to resolve this issue. However, the very next sentence states, if there is a causal link, expect rising incidence anticipated after the introduction of this vaccine in UK in 1988. And the final paragraph provides this conclusion.
We have identified a chronic enterocolitis in children that may be related to neuropsychiatric dysfunction. In most cases, onset of symptoms was after measles, mumps and rubella immunisation. Further investigations are needed to examine this syndrome and its possible relation to this vaccine. Brian Deer is a British-born investigative journalist, best known for his inquiries into medicine, the drug industry, and social issues for the Sunday Times. Among his awards, he's twice been voted the UK's Specialist Journalist of the Year. In 2016, Brian was awarded an honorary Doctor of Letters, presented by the Most Reverend Dr. John Sentamu, Archbishop of York and Chancellor of York St John University, for his impact on society through his outstanding investigative journalism. In September of 2020, he published The Doctor Who Fooled the World by Johns Hopkins University Press that became a bestseller. It was awarded the Eric Hoffer Award for Nonfiction and a gold medal in the Independent Publisher Book Awards, both in 2021. Today, Brian's our special guest on This Medical Life. Brian, welcome.
Hello, nice to see you.
It's wonderful to have you in our company. If I may, as a brief introduction, much of your investigative journalism has focused on Andrew Wakefield. Can you tell us a bit about his background?
Well, he started as training at St Mary's Hospital in London, very famous big hospital, then went off to Toronto in Canada, where he did laboratory work. His specialty, technically, he was a gut surgeon, although he calls himself a gastroenterologist, and that's quite a technical distinction. But he was a gut surgeon. He went into laboratory research, and when he returned to the UK after doing postgraduate training in Toronto, he took up a job at not a particularly renowned hospital in London at the time, the Royal Free in Hampstead, which enabled him to start focusing on what was a personal ambition, and a very creditable ambition, one would have to say, to try and discover definitively the cause of Crohn's disease. Now, that has been a challenge for a long, long time. And whilst there's enormous amounts of epidemiology and any number of theories and hypotheses, it's still not known how to fully explain Crohn's disease and its sister ulcerative colitis. But it was a very noble thing. Now, but this was back in the 1980s. He came back to London in 1988. And many people casting back to that period would remember that was the age of AIDS. That
Yes.
was a period where the discovery of a novel infectious agent that caused this mysterious disease that was creating such havoc around the world was very much in the news. And I think what Wakefield wanted to do in that tradition was to follow a path that I think a lot of young medics and biomedical researchers have gone down, which is to try and I'll find the cause for Parkinson's disease, or I'll find the cause for multiple sclerosis. And then they start looking around. And what he did in this pursuit of the cause of Crohn's disease, he did something that causes, if I put it this way politely, PhD researchers to laugh, was that he went to the hospital library and got out a 2-volume book, Field's Virology, big volumes, like a couple of bricks, and started going through it from start to finish. Like, Field's Virology kind of lists all the viruses known at the time in alphabetical order.
Right.
And so he went through Field's Virology and eventually settled on measles.
So about
And
halfway
so
through the book.
Pretty good way through the book, yeah. He settled on that. He saw a couple of sentences which basically said that during the acute phase of measles, it can be found in, and one of the places it could be found was throughout the GI tract. And so he thought, you can find measles throughout the GI tract, and where it produced kind of like blistering. And he thought, a bit like Koplik spots. Oh, yes, that's what it is. I'll go forward with the hypothesis that measles virus is the cause of Crohn's disease. And off he went. Now, nothing wrong with that so far, but then the scientific method with most researchers, good researchers, kicks in and they try and prove themselves wrong.
Yes.
They try and refute their theory, and he never did, or their hypothesis. He never did. At no time in his career, to this day, and we're talking about decades later, to this day, he's never sought to confront his own a hypothesis and to try to show that he was wrong. And when other researchers, he'd tried to form a group. Well, he formed a group of researchers based at this hospital, the Royal Free, and he tried to draw in other talents, people who had various specialties, like electron microscopy and things like that, and pathology and all the things that he wasn't skilled in, being a gut surgeon, having trained as a gut surgeon. He brought people in, but when they challenged him and said, well, actually, we're not really seeing this, or the facts are not stacking up in support of this, he would dismiss them, go away and carry on anyway. So that was the opening phase of this saga. The next stage would be when he was approached not by a medic or a researcher, but by someone from a very different profession who sought his help in solving their problems.
Just looking at it then, this seems like we've gone through the article just in the first section, and then your discussion there, it seems almost unbelievable that this was such a small study sample and that it made such a large impact, not just on the media, but the medical community. Can you tell us what the response was like at the time?
So now you're talking about the next phase, which is when Wakefield was embarked on a different hypothesis, also concerning measles, which was that measles virus caused autism. That was his next hypothesis. When he failed with Crohn's disease, he moved on to autism. And he was able in February 1998 to get a paper published in the Lancet. He'd previously published in the Lancet. He was one of those people who the Lancet kind of adopted, a bit like the pioneers in the discovery of E. coli, Australians, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren. They were adopted by the Lancet, and they and the Lancet turned out to be right. So further down the GI tract, they adopted Wakefield and his ideas about measles. And so they published a paper by him in February 1998, 4,000 word, 5-page paper, which was a case series of 12 children seen at the hospital who had, in the way it was represented in the Lancet, a constellation of signs and symptoms, which included both autism and what Wakefield said was a novel inflammatory bowel disease. It wasn't Crohn's disease, it wasn't ulcerative colitis, it wasn't as serious as those, but it was in his claim, a novel inflammatory bowel disease. And this paper, which was given a press conference by the institution, the medical school and the hospital at the Royal Free in Hampstead, North London, about 4 miles north of Trafalgar Square, I think it is. And they gave it a press conference. So you had this apparent authoritative research published in the Lancet. Most people think it's like the number 2 general medical journal, backed by a medical school and the hospital, and the press conference, which was chaired by the dean of the medical school, who was himself a noted virologist. It was understandable that there was tremendous media interest, mostly from television that night, because the hospital had put out a 20-minute video of clips for broadcasters to promote this idea. And a scare began, which we see the effects of it even today in the response to the coronavirus pandemic and the campaigning that we see from really an acorn in that paper, which has now grown into an oak tree of public anxiety over vaccine safety.
And as a journalist myself, I can see that Marshall McLuhan and his work, The Medium as the Message, really at work here. When you've got a paper that's being presented with all that pageantry, it has a certain place on a pedestal in the way it's being delivered that would keep some people from questioning too closely.
Well, yes, although for a long time the complaint was made that this was a media creation. This whole thing was a media creation, and journalists should have been more aware that a case series of 12 children doesn't get you very far down the road. But when you think about it, autism was first classically described on 11 children in the Baltimore area of the United States. AIDS itself, before it came to be known as AIDS, but the disease which came to be known as AIDS was first characterized on the basis of 5 gay men in Los Angeles. Now, the idea that one would just dismiss this case series wasn't really in keeping even with the 1990s, because it may be that these doctors at this hospital had just got lucky and had stumbled on the first cases of what might be a hidden epidemic of catastrophic injuries that weren't being noticed, weren't being picked up on in other hospitals. All of these 12 children came to a pediatric bowel clinic at the Royal Free. So immediately you're thinking, well, this in itself might just be a freak occurrence. And that's how it looked. It looked as though they'd just turned up randomly. And basically, if you were clinicians working in that environment, if it was the case that you were running bowel clinics for children, and over a period of, I think it was about 9 months, a series of parents turned up with their children and made a strikingly similar complaint. My child was developing perfectly normally. He or she, in fact, 11 of them were boys, 1 was a girl. He or she received the measles, mumps, and rubella MMR vaccine. And within days, they were showing the first symptoms of autism. Now, that was the position that was represented in this paper. And if that was right, that needed explaining. And yes, okay, it's hard to expect newspapers and television stations who, at least in the UK, if not always in the US, can't afford to employ doctors to be their medical correspondents, because doctors want more money than we get eventually.
Yes. I did look at Travis as you said that.
Yeah. So the idea that it was all the media was the medical establishment's response. They just said, oh, well, it was only 12 children. This is all the media. It's all a lot of hoo-ha about nothing. Listen to us. We say the MMR vaccine is safe. There is no worries. It's been given to however many 100 million children or whatever. Take no notice of this. So they appealed to their own authority. That's where the situation rather failed, because perhaps the most remarkable aspect, well, at least to me, it sounds weird saying I'm at the center of the most remarkable aspect of something, but nevertheless, I'm going to, because it is pretty extraordinary that it was a journalist and a newspaper, the Sunday Times in London, which exposed this paper for what it really was. I was able to go round the back of that paper, if you like, find out who the children were, find out what was wrong with them, find out what wasn't wrong with them, and show that that paper was, in the judgment of the editors of the British Medical Journal some years later, an elaborate fraud. And this paper was indeed an elaborate fraud. It was a concoction at every level and in every way.
Now, just on that, because the article specifically states 12 children who reportedly being consecutively referred. Effectively, this was a random sample. How were they actually selected?
Okay, well, that was the first aspect of it. The first, if you like, unpeeling the onion, that was the first thing we got onto. Way back in 2004, when summers were cooler and we were all probably getting more sex than we are now, so many years later, we were able to show that Wakefield had been hired to do precisely this work by a firm of lawyers who were hoping to sue the manufacturers of MMR, the vaccines. There were 3 brands of vaccine, and they were hoping to sue these people in a purely speculative class action lawsuit. For years and years, various vaccines have come along, and as soon as, and it occurs not just with vaccines, but pretty much anywhere. If an issue arises and lawyers see an opportunity to sue, then they will sue. These lawyers had no doctors at all who evidenced the case that they wanted to make, which was that the MMR vaccine caused some form of brain injury, because they knew that back in the 1970s and 1980s, there'd been a similar concern about an earlier vaccine, one in fact that's not available anymore, but against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. It's an old vaccine that's subsequently been withdrawn and replaced with something else. In that scare, which is way before most people's memories these days, and I had actually investigated retrospectively, looking back into history, that scare was believed by very large numbers of doctors and scientists, believed that at a very low level, that particular vaccine did cause what was then described as permanent brain damage in a very small number of children. They did believe that. Subsequently discovered that on the balance of probabilities, it didn't. And there were a number of very high-profile court cases that threw that out. But you see, what this lawyer, a man named Richard Barr, and Wakefield, this London-based doctor, Andrew Wakefield, were doing, was trying to move over the DTP story over into MMR. And they were able to get funding from the British government's legal aid fund, which funds lawsuits for people who can't afford to sue. And of course, no one can afford to sue drug companies. So they got public money. And behind the scenes, Wakefield had been commissioned and funded by the legal aid fund to carry out this research on children. And so that's the first part. And the second part of it was that these children had been sent to the hospital by what we would today call an anti-vaccine group and by the lawyer. And they turned up precisely in order to make this allegation. So whilst the paper represented as a finding that in 2 out of 3 of these 12 cases, it said 8 out of 12, that the story was put forward. The parents were found to have said it was the MMR doctor, when in fact the claim that it was the MMR wasn't a finding at all. It was a qualification to take part. They had come precisely because they were making these allegations. So this wasn't a random sample at all. This was a collection of lawyers, clients, and contacts of an anti-vaccine group. So they were bound to get the result. These people were bound to turn up at the hospital and say it was the MMR doctor, because that's why they'd been asked to come to the hospital in the first place. And it wasn't even 8 out of 12. It was 11 out of 12 made the complaint at the hospital. One later changed their story. The final one changed their story and later made the complaint that was the MMR, marking a full house of 12. But Wakefield reduced it down. You see, if you published a paper that said 12 children and all the parents said it was the MMR, immediately the peer reviewers, the editors of the Lancet, and anybody who read it would say, well, they would, wouldn't they? Because it's a group of 12 families whose parents blamed the MMR, which wouldn't evidence anything other than that they had been brought to the hospital for this reason. So he reduced it down to 8 out of 12. So it was kind of vaguely epidemiological. So 8 out of 12, 2 out of 3 families of children with autism, blame it on the MMR vaccine. Bang.
I have to ask, though, if I was standing up against some anti-vaxxers and questioning this, and they said, Steve, do your own research, which is a very lovely term, I'm sure much enamoured of by you, how easy would it have been for me to find that nuance before your expose?
Well, it would have been impossible. You just wouldn't, because the assumption is, it goes back to something, I don't know how well it's picked up around the world, in Australia and the United States and around the world. An earlier research fraud was the case of Piltdown Man, where it was claimed that someone had discovered the missing link between humans and apes, and basically they just chiseled the data and created this assembly. And the way it succeeded was that a chap wouldn't do such a thing. So if your mind, you take the Wakefield story, if in some momentary nightmare you thought, well, that's so extraordinary, maybe it's made up, maybe it's not true, well, then it would have to be fraud. It would have to be. If it wasn't true, it would have to be fraud. And so you'd think, well, a chap would never do that. And that's what the medical establishment did. I mean, I'm not leaving out chapesses for this moment. I mean, back in those days, well, you might think of it more, well, I think the medical establishment probably still does think in terms of chaps, but a chap wouldn't do such a thing. So they dismissed it. But I saw it because this connection of a development of symptoms within days of vaccination had also been presented in the research that was published back in the 1970s that had set off the scare over the DTP triple vaccine, the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine. And there, another doctor, 3.5 miles from the Royal Free at the very famous hospital, the Hospital of Sick Children, had published a paper with a couple of junior doctors where they presented evidence of, it was a case series attempting to evidence a connection between the triple DTP vaccine and brain damage within specifically a 14-day window after vaccination. 14-day window. What he'd done, what the consultant had done, was sent a couple of juniors to the hospital archive and told them to pull out those files where a child had suffered symptoms of a neurological illness within 14 days. That was his window. He chose 14 days. And in the Wakefield paper, these 8 out of 12 families, the way it's represented in the paper, these 8 out of 12 families turned up and they said it was the MMR doctor and it came on within days, and the range of those days was specifically 14 days. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a coincidence. That's a bit of a coincidence. And I started looking at the paper very carefully, and I thought to myself, right when I first read it, I thought there's lawyers behind this, but you could never, ever prove it. How could you ever prove where the children, for a anonymized, totally confidential, behind that awesome veil of medical confidentiality, where those children came from and what was wrong with them? Impossible. How could it ever be done? But I did it. Ha ha.
I think we need to pause briefly because there's much to reflect on there. We've built up to the story. We're going to tackle the second half in just a moment. On January the 28th, 2010, the UK General Medical Council Fitness to Practice panel issued a statement. Andrew Wakefield, British gastroenterologist who sparked a worldwide scare of the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, has been found guilty of serious professional misconduct and struck off the medical register by the General Medical Council. In summation, the case made against him was the only sanction that is appropriate to protect patients and is in the wider public interest, including the maintenance of public trust and confidence in the profession, and is proportionate to the serious and wide-ranging findings made against him. Lancet issued a retraction of the article in February 2010, stating the findings were incorrect, particularly the claims that the children were consecutively referred and that investigations were approved by local ethics committee. However, the impact continues to this very day.
I was just wanting to ask you, Brian, the article leaves off and says, vaccine isn't certain here. We need to do further studies on this. So there was some articles associated with immunohistochemistry and other virology studies meant to have come through the pretty much the article publications. And I believe his name was attached to it, but how did he end up producing that evidence?
Well, finishing first with the Lancet paper of 1998. So after the first revelations that Wakefield was working for a firm of lawyers and that the children had been brought to the hospital in pursuit of a lawsuit, we then went on to show that he had a raft of business interests, specifically ahead of the press conference where he presented the paper. At that press conference and in media materials distributed to broadcasters, he called for the MMR vaccine to be suspended and for parents to shun the 3-in-1 shot and instead have their children vaccinated at yearly intervals with single shots of measles, mumps, and rubella. What he didn't say was that 8 months before, he'd filed for a patent on his own single measles shot. And whilst his particular technology that he proposed was sufficient to make anybody involved in this area of science I've ever spoken to laugh, it would nevertheless have been very attractive to potential investors in a raft of companies that he and various business associates, including one of the parents of the children in the study, had set up in order to exploit the public fear that he created. So this vaccine and various other products, tests and things like that, were products that if they worked at all, which they wouldn't have done, but you wouldn't know that. Well, one wouldn't know that unless one had quite a bit of expertise in some of these areas. They would nevertheless only stand any chance of making you any money from, if you like, mug punters, if confidence in MMR was damaged. So he, working for this lawyer and with these business schemes, the longer he created this scare and the bigger the scare became, the more money he would make, either in lawyers' payments or in various business schemes. So we found that out. And then he sued. Wakefield sued me and a television station here and the Sunday Times, and sprayed these lawsuits at us, most of which he then, well, all of which he tried to freeze once he'd served them. So he wanted to be able to tell the world he was suing us, but not actually go through with it. So we went to court and had him ordered to sue us, ordered to go forward with his case. And in the course of that, I read these children's hospital medical records in strictly controlled circumstances, with a lawyer sitting at the end of the table, pursuant to a court order. The judge ordered that I be allowed to read these children's unredacted medical records. So when the General Medical Council in the UK launched its own investigation to reinvestigate what I'd already published to see that it was right, because if what I was saying, then he shouldn't be practicing medicine, and indeed they struck him off and the Lancet retracted its paper. That happened. But nevertheless, I knew what was in these children's records. So when the hearing of the General Medical Council began in 2007, it ran longer than the trial of O.J. Simpson. It went on for 217 days, during which the records of these children were ventilated over and over and over. And I was sitting in the room as this was done. Their pathology reports, their virology, every last thing, their clinical notes, when the histories that had been taken by local doctors looking after these children, all of that were laid out. I hoovered them all up because the case hinges, and this will be interesting to doctors, I think, and in The Doctor Who Fooled the World, my book, I go into this in quite a lot of detail so you can see what was revealed during those hearings. It was the case that really, while Wakefield was doing research, clearly doing research, because he had no clinical rights. He was he was, as I say in the book, a doctor without patients. He was not a clinician. In fact, he wasn't even a pathologist. It's not quite clear what he was really. And his co-accused, one of his co-accused, was an Australian, John Walker Smith, who'd been professor of paediatric gastroenterology in Sydney. And he'd come to London. He'd gone to Bart's Hospital, which he regarded to be what he called, in his words, the mother hospital of the empire. But it had been enticed to move from Bart's Hospital to the Royal Free to work with Wakefield. His case that he chose to present to the GMC was that, au contraire, he never was doing any research at all, and that these children were seen purely for their clinical care. It wasn't true, put it bluntly, I would say. He was lying, because I've got all the details, and I've even got his book where he describes it as research and what it was all about. But nevertheless, his defense was that, no, we weren't doing research, it was all clinical care. But in order to make that case, he had to defend, or at least represent, the prosecution had to make a case against the cases and the reporting of the cases of each of those children. So you had like 11 or 12 mini hearings within the bigger hearing where he would have to, and his lawyers would have to, lay out the clinical and laboratory results on all these children. And from that, it was absolutely clear to me, sitting in the room, that Lancet paper was a concoction. Every aspect of it, he'd altered clinical histories, he'd altered pathology, he'd made up a new disease which he called autistic enterocolitis, which is what you do if you're running if you're doing something for a lawsuit. You make up a new entity. I think the pharmaceutical industry do it as well, don't they? All the time, like trying to make up a new condition that they can sell products against, and lawyers do much the same kind of thing. The big difference being that in science and medical research, the standard of proof required is very high. It's, sometimes people talk about 95% before you ever, really get to be sure. But whereas in the law, it's the balance of probabilities. So you could get a 51% result. It's a much lower standard of proof, but you could nevertheless make a lot of money and set off a whole load of stuff through lawsuits. So that was the name of their game. But at the end of the day, he made up this thing called autistic enterocolitis. And again, he challenged our reporting of this, and he got somebody, an associate, to produce the histopathology reports on these children for each of the children, going around a series of bowel biopsies in the standard route round the bowel as far as the ileum, all the way into the small intestine, where Crohn's disease is most characteristically found. If you want to know that. So they did us, and this associate of Wakefield's turned these over to the British Medical Journal as evidence that Wakefield had found what he claimed to find. The British Medical Journal sent them to me, and even by that time, I'd done enough research to be able to sit and read through. They were like pro formas, tick box things for different aspects of like the biopsies and what the pathologist had seen. Even I, as someone with no training in medicine or science, the only training has been like on the job of this journalism, which, has taken me many years, as you can imagine, to get on top of some of these issues. I had finally got my pronunciation of ileum and ileum right. I think it's at least America, it's ileum. But let me tell you, when I started this, I couldn't spell Crohn's disease. So to get to the point where I understood this, but by that point of this associate of Wakefield's turning over these documents, I had got to the point. It took me 6 minutes to go through them and say, these don't show anything. These are normal findings. These are well within the range of normal results from the guts that you could find anywhere from anybody. And we then put that out to peer review, and all the reviewers said the same thing from all across the specialties: gastroenterology, pediatric pathology, the whole thing. They all said the same thing. And this disease that they'd made up for litigation didn't exist.
Before Dr. Travis Brown continues with his next question, 6 minutes to check off those. You as a general pathologist, that's about your range?
Yeah, we could swap jobs, although I don't think I could do the investigative journalist anywhere near as well. But can I ask, though, here's the thing that surprised me about all of this. Now, Andrew Wakefield was struck off the register. His articles were retracted, but isn't exactly the story that you would think of a disgraced doctor going off and never being heard from again. He's living in the US. He has a multi-million-dollar lifestyle. He was even pegged to be included in the Trump White House in 2016. He's now effectively almost like the poster boy of anti-vaccine movement. Like, how do you sort of digest that sort of going from this article to that?
Well, he did what, I'm not sure whether Trump's people learnt this from him, but I think this is a pretty well-worn path, which is that he was able to use essentially kind of a judo maneuver, which is to use the weight of the onslaught against him as evidence of his innocence. Yep. So what he did was to say that I'm working for the pharmaceutical industry, and this was the pharmaceutical industry and Rupert Murdoch and this and that and the other, who were out to get him because his work was so threatening to the vaccination program. And therefore, the fact of his disgrace was proof of his honesty. It's a peculiar paradox that you see Trump himself using, most particularly at the moment, where he's been facing all these criminal charges. So he then says, well, the fact that they've brought all these criminal charges shows that I'm an honest man doing the right thing. Please send me your money. And people have. I mean, Trump has now made more money out of the allegation that he falsified records than he would have done if one had just left him alone. So you kind of got that paradox, but it does work. Does work.
Can I ask then, one of the things that I was thinking about in reading this article is it seems like the Lancet put out this article and then 12 years later ended up saying retraction. Was there any responsibility taken by the Lancet in all of this?
No, I mean, the Richard Horton, who still edits the Lancet today, who edited it then, who sadly, I mean, I wish him well, and I hope he's getting over this, had a diagnosis of stage 4 malignant melanoma not that long ago. You know, that particular field of medicine is making enormous advances, and a lot of it in Australia. So I wish him well with that. But if you go back over, so I don't particularly want to put any stress on him in any way, but no, they defended it. They tried to see me off. They tried to sabotage my investigation by releasing my results before, when I put my first results to the Lancet, to the meeting at their offices, which involved their whole editorial board and went on for 5 hours. They immediately, in consultation with Wakefield and his associates, put out denials before we'd even published the story in the first place. Now, they set out to spoil the story and to sabotage my work, and would do nothing until the General Medical Council findings, at which point they used a very sort of miserly grounds for retraction, kind of technical grounds for retraction. So they were never actually owning up to the fact that they had been, all of this had been explained to them and incredibly explained to them, and they'd done nothing about it. They were hoping it would go away. Richard Horton never wanted a General Medical Council hearing, and they just thought it was going to sit in the record. And that takes you to one of the great, to me, what's the great lesson in all this? And as I say in The Doctor Who Fooled the World, if he could do what he did, Andrew Wakefield, if he could do what he did, who else is doing what in the hospitals and laboratories around the world? Because medical journals don't admit their mistakes. They're happy to, if they publish a paper, they don't want people saying, oh, this is fraud or you have to investigate this. They just want to publish it and then get on with another paper. So they rely on peer review and verifiability, reproducibility by somebody else, by some other group. And they're happy with that. The institution itself wasn't wanting to damage its reputation by owning up or carrying out an investigation into what happened. So they tried to see me off. They tried to basically carry on as before. And this is going on everywhere. And now today, when we see the anti-vaccine movement and Wakefield at its heart moving over, and they, in the last couple of years, to the pandemic, the SARS-CoV-2 virus pandemic, the infrastructure which Wakefield had put in place and which had grown out of campaigning against the MMR vaccine was already in place and ready to spring into action when COVID-19 came along. So that's how you see the transition between the scare over the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and what we have today in all the campaigning and the bizarre kind of claims that are made about COVID-19. And Wakefield's there at the heart of it with the energy of the activists and people he brought together during the concern over MMR.
As a fellow journalist myself, I have a naive trust and love for the Fourth Estate. It's been battered and bruised, of course, of late, and I would have given publications like the Lancet an honorary membership in that field for trying to take that objective pathway. The story, as you've told it, is very sobering, to put it lightly. But as a final point in our conversation, for doctors listening in, scientists, members of the medical profession, what do you think they can learn from this case to apply in their daily practice?
Well, in their daily practice, I'm not sure about that. I think doctors and scientists involved in this area need to accept and raise pressure for change, recognizing that hospitals are subject to inspection. Prisons are subject to inspection. All kinds of restaurants are subject to inspection to protect the public. But biomedical science and laboratory research is, in most of the world, not subject to any kind of independent inspection, even if it was simply a small team in Sydney or Melbourne or one of the great cities of Australia, or here in London or in Washington or wherever, who were able to go out and close a laboratory or close a research facility on a no-fault basis and carry out a full audit, just the way health authorities are able to public health authorities are able to do with restaurants. And I tell you, when I wrote a piece, invited piece by Nature invited me to write a piece, and I made this parallel, Nature rejected my article because they said, you cannot compare scientists with restaurant managers. You can't suggest that our integrity is not going. Now, one cannot assume that scientists' integrity does not exceed the integrity of restaurant managers. We are the house magazine of science, and they rejected my piece. The British Medical Journal invited me to write a piece about the coronavirus pandemic, and I raised this issue about checking, about an inspectorate of some kind, that people would at least be aware that the potential was that they might find themselves having their lab closed and their data examined. The British Medical Journal rejected the piece because it began, if not now, then when? If we don't, with this pandemic, tighten up the standards in scientific research and the scrutiny of scientific research, which we cannot just leave to journal editors and institutions. BMJ said, you can't say that. We need something more nuanced. So it wasn't published there either. So, that's my message. Something needs to be done, and eventually it will be done. But I just hope it isn't after some extraordinary catastrophe arising from some piece of fraud in biomedical research. And my last point would be, to close this, I started on this path on the integrity of research in 1986, when I investigated a British scientist working at Deakin University, Geelong, who faked all his work on a new generation of contraceptive pill. And his name was Michael Briggs. He drank himself to death. And since that time, I've thought, how can it be that someone could sit, as he did, at a laboratory near Melbourne? Well, he didn't have a laboratory. He didn't even have a laboratory. He claimed to have dogs. And I said, when I met him, I would have heard them barking. Didn't even have, just sat and made up papers on something as critical as the safety of oral contraceptives. But he did. And that was the beginning of it for me. And that's where the story, even today, takes me, the integrity of biomedical research.
What a tale. And dear listener, if you're hearing this, it means that our interview with Brian did pass our internal ethical board. That's true, is it, Travis?
Very true.
Yes. Brian, dear, seriously, on behalf of all of us, thank you for the work you do, and may you continue this research, this fight for a lot longer still.
Thank you. My book, The Doctor Who Fooled the World, is available on Amazon and many good bookshops.
And we will have links to that in our show notes and on our website.
Thank you.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.